Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about the world of Exandria and Dungeons and Dragons. All right, so Exandria is a really fascinating subject right now in Dungeons and Dragons because we just got our second Exandria book in the current edition of Dungeons and Dragons, and that is Exandria based. All right, so what is Exandria? So it's the entire point of this video is I think that's a complicated question and I want to explore it together. So the simple answer, right, which I think is 100% wrong, is Exandria is the world of Critical Role, right? That's what it says in Call to Netherdeep, the second Exandria Dungeons and Dragons book that Matthew Mercer quite literally delivered, right? And it's really interesting because in Call to Netherdeep, we get this, a deeper dive into what Exandria is. So one of the things that's clearly laid out in Call to Netherdeep about Exandria is its regions. It has 4 regions, okay? It has Wildemount. Explorer's Guide to Wildemount covers Wildemount. It covers it. It's the first D&D Exandria book, and it covers Wildemount in incredible detail, okay? The second is Marquette. Marquette is the current setting for the Critical Role web series, okay? The story that they're telling together each day and each week, right? With Matthew Mercer as the Dungeon Master and then the traditional cast of Critical Role, right? And so Marquette is this second region in Exandria, and it's being explored right now in season 3 of and I think it's Bell's Hells. I think that's that's the name of the third season. Bell's Hells, I think, is the correct name. Mighty Nine was season 2. Vox Machina was season 1, and I think the third one is called Bell's Hells. So Marquette is set in Bell's Hells. Please correct me if any of that's wrong. Correct me below if any of that's wrong. So so you have Wildemount, highly defined within Dungeons and Dragons. You have Marquette. Marquette is pretty well defined within Call to Netherdeep. Not all of Call to Netherdeep is set there, but literally easily 50-60 pages of the book deal with Marquette, things that happen in Marquette, okay? And then beyond that, you have Isilra, and so there's 4 of them. Oh, and Tal'Dorei, right? So let's talk about Tal'Dorei. Tal'Dorei is not fully defined in Dungeons & Dragons. However, this is really critical, okay? It is specifically listed in the Call to Netherdeep Dungeons & Dragons book. So Tal'Dorei says in the Dungeons & Dragons book, right, Call to Netherdeep, it says that Tal'Dorei is a region of Exandria. So while you're not given detail to run in Tal'Dorei, you 100% as a Dungeons & Dragons Dungeon Master are 100% permissioned by canon, by the books, by the rules to run in Tal'Dorei, okay? So, and like, basically you can run anything in Dungeons and Dragons, right? But there's a difference between permissioning, and there's also this difference between canon, right? So, here's a good example. Like, everything in Acquisitions Incorporated, that is a real book, right? That is canon. Is it resonant? Does it resonate at the frequency of Dungeons and Dragons? I don't know about that, right? Like, even Ravnica. Ravnica is a great example. Ravnica is one of the best written, best art, best designed Dungeons and Dragons books that's ever been created. And it sits uncracked on the vast... First of all, it sits, I think, probably unbought, right? And on any shelf, it's the best looking book because it never gets touched. It's D&D steampunk, and who wanted that, right? Like, and so, and also, if you wanted that, Eberron does it way better, right? So, and way less. Actually, I'm not even sure it does it better. It does it less complicated, right? And it does seem to resonate at the frequency of Dungeons and Dragons, right? So Tal'Dorei, you are now permissioned in the book to run in Tal'Dorei. You are also permissioned to run in the Exandria region called Isilra, right? Isilra, right? What the heck is it? I have no idea. Like, I just don't. I guess I don't know Critical Role enough to know this region, or it's undefined and they're going to define it in the future. But I thought it was really interesting. If you're a Dungeons and Dragons player, you have been given permission to run in Wildmount. You've been actually provisioned to run very well to run in Wildmount, provisioned to run in Marquette, permissioned to run in Tal'Dorei, permissioned to run in Isilra. And I hear you're like, oh, Scott, you can run. You can run very well provisioned in Tal'Dorei. There's this jank third-party book that Darlington Press put out that Sly Flourish said bows like a rainbow, right? So here's the issue. I don't count that as Dungeons and Dragons. Third-party nonsense is not for me. Like, I can barely get myself through the 7,000 pages of canon that already exists for the book. I don't need to sully my collection, and you don't need to sully your collection with third-party nonsense, right? That Tal'Dorei is not official D&D, and I don't even think it even seems useful or helpful to add to any Dungeons and Dragons current edition collection. It's junk. I don't think the Tal'Dorei book is worth buying. That's my opinion, right? And here's why, right? Matthew Mercer's got a real connection. He can call up Ray Winninger and say, hey, can we make Tal'Dorei real rather than some third-party nonsense that any real dungeon master would go, I don't know if I want to allow that, because the moment I allow that, you're going to be knocking on my door with a whole bunch of outrageously bad, unbalanced junk from a bunch of other third-party content makers, right? So, I don't want to open that door, and I don't think the Tal'Dorei book actually counts as real D&D. That's my 2 cents. Let me know in the comments below if you disagree. And then Isilra is your permission, but we really don't know anything about it, right? It's not there. So here's the question. Is Exandria the Critical Role world, right? No, absolutely not. It is a Dungeons and Dragons world. And you're just like, Scott, there's a legal contract that says it's that Critical Role owns it. And they probably won't be able to print it in the next few versions, right? Well, that gets a little sticky, because here's the issue, right? We don't have Greyhawk or Mystara for 5th edition provisioned, but we absolutely have it permissioned, okay? Greyhawk and Mystara are name-checked quite literally in Ghosts of Saltmarsh, right? So those are real settings in 5th edition. They're not provisioned, they're permissioned. There's a difference, right? And so the thing is, if Critical Role says this is our world, right? Where's your book? Where's your rule set to run it with? Oh, you can't run it without Dungeons and Dragons because it's not really yours, and you sold your soul to Dungeons and Dragons and to Wizards of the Coast, and Exandria is actually a Dungeons and Dragons world and not even remotely a real Critical Role world? So you can talk about contracts all you want, but the reality is the D&D community, the second Wildmount and Called Another Deep dropped, that made it a real Dungeons and Dragons world, not a conceptual world, a very real world, right? And so if you say that Tal'Dorei really is a Critical Role world, what are you going to run it with? All you could really run it with is Dungeons and Dragons or some other game which nobody cares about, right? And so the reality is, you could say what you like, but functionally, Exandria is actually a Dungeons and Dragons world and will be a Dungeons and Dragons world for every edition until Matthew Mercer puts on his big girl pants and actually makes a game to play it with, which I predict he will never do because he ain't got that kind of grit, and it would take going toe to toe with the beast, Wizards of the Coast, and he just ain't got the chutzpah for it. That's my take. That's my take. Exandria is a Dungeons and Dragons world, not a Critical Role world, which it says in a Dungeons and Dragons book. That's my take. What's your take? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Let me know in the comments below. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.